Welcome back to the Cage Rage Podcast. This is Devin with the CRP, and this is a CRP News Roundup, a weekly show dedicated to briefly analyzing the top stories in the world of mixed martial arts from the past week. It is Wednesday, August the 28th, 2019, and in this past weekend, no UFC card. It's been a very busy schedule this year, busier than it's ever been before. And this was actually a blue moon week off of any sort of fight night for the Ultimate Fighting Championship. So what better timing for the notorious one himself, Conor McGregor, to come out and have a sit-down live on ESPN interview with none other than MMA's premier journalist himself, Ariel Helwani. And it's been really the talk of the MMA world for the past 5 days because it was the first sit-down interview that he's had in a while, and he did say a lot. Number one, Helwani did right by just coming straight out and asking him about the big altercation in the Irish bar involving a elderly man who apparently insulted his whiskey that Conor clearly on video walked up and hit. And McGregor did come out and apologize for the incident, accepted his guilt for it, seemed to take full responsibility. And this is also just, he's still not in the clear for the sexual assault allegation that was brought against him earlier this year. And on top of that, earlier this year, we also had the case of him breaking that fan's phone, I believe, down in South Florida. And just less than 2 years ago was the infamous Khabib bus attack. So it's just been a long string of incident after incident after incident with Conor McGregor and his outside the cage antics that Helwani did a very good job of bringing to light. And Helwani even went as far to bring up that this isn't an isolated incident. We've seen this story before, Conor. He said, we've seen athletes, we've seen entertainers that get rich fast and they self-implode. And he asked him, basically had him do some self-evaluating right there on air. Is this you? And Conor, there's been a lot of, breakdown of him, what his mannerisms were in this interview. I heard Brian Campbell of Showtime stated, which I thought was a profound thought. He said that he seemed like a washed-up rock star, which I thought was very interesting. Because what we fell in love with Conor McGregor, either love him or hate him, either we loved to hate him or we just loved him for who he was his unshakable and undeniable and clearly authentic confidence and charisma. I didn't see that this much in this interview. I actually saw a man in my own analysis that I feel like sees the sport is going on without him. He kind of drank his own Kool-Aid and believed that it wouldn't happen, that he was actually becoming bigger than the promotion. And then when he sees Nate Diaz go out the week before, put on a great performance, first performance since their infamous two fight, just mega fights that they had. And people kind of expected maybe that Diaz would get on the mic and talk about Conor, signaling for a trilogy fight, a big money trilogy fight. Didn't do that at all. He went to Jorge Masvidal, and what does the internet do right afterwards? They love it. That's what they want to see. They're not even worried about Conor. They want to see Masvidal and they want to see Diaz. And I got this idea that you got a guy who sees this sport can survive without him, that there is going to be big fights without him, and that he's trying to stay relevant and fighting to stay relevant. And speaking of fighting, he did indicate in this interview that he was preparing for a late summer return this year. But broke his hand in a sparring match. And said that training's been going good. He looks like he's in good shape by all the photos we've seen. And he says that he's still eyeing a year-end return. And he listed off a plethora of the who's who of all names. He listed the Khabib and Dustin winner, Said he definitely wants to get back to the Khabib rematch. That's what he's got to get. And then for his legacy and for his resume, he does need to get back to the Khabib fight. He mentioned a trilogy with Diaz. He mentioned Jorge Masvidal. He mentioned Justin Gaethje, who he said was actually the front runner of the potential fight for him at the end of the summer if he wouldn't have broke his hand. And Justin Gaethje is getting ready to fight Donald Cerrone, who was also rumored to fight Conor McGregor earlier in the year. He even mentioned Tony Ferguson, which I believe he might be the first person I've ever heard that's actually even uttered his name in a call-out. He mentioned a Jose Aldo rematch, which has been kind of rumored about as a possibility. He even mentioned Frankie Edgar, which was kind of odd because Frankie Edgar's just lost at 45 to the title holder Max Holloway and has been talking about dropping down to 35, but they were rumored to fight years ago and never happened, and he even mentioned that he'd be willing to share the octagon with Frankie Edgar. And as I said, my overall analysis of this interview was a man who clearly is now a little bit more anxious to get back in the cage and do what he needs to do because he sees that his reputation, his legacy, his relevance is slipping away and the sport is going on without him. And he's fighting to keep relevant. But the thing is, Conor, that's exactly what you need to do to stay relevant, is to fight. Moving on, Bellator 225 was the only big notable card of any prominence over the past weekend. And without the UFC card, it really took prominence for the weekend for hardcore MMA fans. And in the main event, we saw Sergey Kharitonov defeat Matt Mitrione via second round TKO, uppercuts, and hammer fist. Mitrione had kind of a malfunctioning mouthpiece throughout the fight. I believe it dropped 3 different times in the first round, was even warned by the ref that if it happened again, then he would get a point taken. Then his mouthpiece falls out in the second round, and then like 5 seconds afterwards, he gets dropped by an uppercut and knocked out. And which was kind of a shame. It was clearly, it was visibly seen on Mitrione that became a mental block, that this mouthpiece didn't fit right and it kept falling out of his mouth. But nevertheless, Sergey Kharitonov gets a big win. And also in the co-main event, we had another big heavyweight bout between former Bellator heavyweight champion Vitaly Minakov defeating Tim Johnson by first round KO. And now when we look at Kharitonov and we look at Minakov, you got Kharitonov 30-7, 2-0 in Bellator, 11-1 with 2 no contests in between there dating back to 2011. So he's been on a very good run. And this was a big win for him. And when you look at Vitaly Minakov, he's 22-1. He was undefeated until his fight prior to this fight when he lost a close decision to Czech Congo. He's the former Bellator heavyweight champion, and now he's back in the win column after, as I mentioned, the decision loss to Congo. Speaking of Congo, Congo will be fighting at Bellator 226 in just a couple weeks, September 7th, against the current heavyweight champion of Bellator, Ryan Bader. I believe that if things work in a logical sequence, which I always mention that they never do, we could possibly see a Kharitonov versus Minakov fight in the winner of Bader and Congo. And the other notable name that we have to mention from this Bellator 225 card was the notable win of the ever-inspiring Nick Newell, who is a congenital amputee, was born and had his arm amputated. Very inspiring man, and he's otherwise known as the one-arm fighter. He goes out there and gets a first-round arm triangle choke win over Corey Browning on the Bellator platform. And every time I see Nick Newell, my first question is, he just reminds me, what is our excuse? This man is a born congenital amputee. His arm, of all things. You know, when I think of reasons to be thankful in this life, I have arms. Can you imagine living life without arms? It reminds me of that video that I seen just recently on Facebook of the no-arm kid who's jumping up on the box and how difficult it must be to even have just one arm. And this man's out there fighting at the highest levels of MMA. So Nick Newell is an inspiration to all and definitely indicts us to those who take for granted the physical capabilities that we have. Moving on, the Dana White Contender Series Season 3 wrapped up this week. Last night, actually, Tuesday, with 3 more contracts awarded, making it 30 total for the 10-event season this year. Unbeaten middleweight Dusko Todorovic lightweight Peter Barrett, and featherweight TJ Brown were all awarded contracts on this event. And as I mentioned, 30 new fighters were awarded contracts this year on this season of the Contender Series. Moving on, UFC China is this weekend, and UFC returning to mainland China. This event's otherwise known as UFC on ESPN Plus 15, and it is headlined by a big women's strawweight title bout between new champion Jessica Andrade taking on China's own Weili Zhang. And Jessica Andrade really needs no introduction. This is a woman who's coming off one of the most impressive strawweight one-punch knockouts over Karolina Kowalkiewicz, and then obviously the infamous just power slam of Rose Namajunas to win the belt just a few months ago. Weili Zhang coming in 3-0 in the UFC, 19-1 overall, a big star, and obviously got this shot because of the Asian market that they're going into in mainland China. Because when we look at this, as soon as Jessica Andrade won the belt from Rose Namajunas in a fight that she was losing up until that second round, there was questions about who she would fight next. Obviously, the Rose Namajunas rematch was on the table. And I think that would have been probably the best option if Rose would have been willing to just go right back in on it. The other option was Joanna Jędrzejczyk, which was the last person to beat Jessica Andrade, and is somebody that I still would favor over Andrade if they were to fight. Another opportunity was a young contender that's highly ranked right now, ranked higher than Weili Zhang, Tatiana Suarez, who's undefeated and is highly touted, great wrestler. She was definitely on the radar as a potential option. And if it wasn't one of those three, there was a lot of talk about Michelle Watterson, who is a big name, was on the Sports Illustrated body issue cover, known as the Karate Hottie, was on Joe Rogan. I mean, people know her. She's on a good streak, comes from a good team. She was an option. Nobody really saw Weili Zhang coming out and getting this bout, but it makes sense when you understand that they are trying to pivot toward more international markets. They want to be a international brand, a global brand. And going into Asia, the most developing area of the world in terms of economic boom, it only made sense to do this. So big women's strawweight bout, Weili Zhang getting the shot, going up against the new champion Jessica Andrade, the powerhouse. I think this is going to be a great fight. I'll be on doing my wagers with Miguel later on this week to give a little bit further analysis and more prediction on that. I do want to talk a little bit about the co-main event of the evening also on this. We got number 14 in the welterweight rankings. Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos is taking on China's own Jinglang Li, who's 8-3 in the UFC. The thing with Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos, he is one of the most overlooked and underappreciated fighters right now in the sport. Very under the radar. When you look at this guy, he's 21-5 in MMA. Very well-rounded, 7-1 in the UFC, and he's on a 7-fight win streak. If he wins this fight, he'll be on an 8-fight win streak and maybe the best division in the sport. And when I look at this welterweight division, I mean, just completely stacked from top to bottom. And here you got the number 14 ranked guy in Dos Santos. And if he wins this, it'll be his 8th win in a row. Him, Leon Edwards will both have 8 wins in a row, and Santiago Ponzinibbio has 7 wins in a row. And they're all fighting in this very hot division that is just so deep right now at 170 pounds. Jinglang Li, though, 8-3 in the UFC, and he is getting a big opportunity to get himself into the top 15 rankings in his home country. So, big opportunity there. Going on to further news, Anthony Rumble Johnson has announced that he is preparing a 2020 return to the Octagon, and he wants to do this at the heavyweight division. And he hasn't competed since April 8th of 2017 when he was choked out in a light heavyweight title fight against Daniel Cormier. And according to his manager, Ali Abdelaziz, he has entered the USADA testing pool, and he is eyeing a potential return fights against maybe Alistair Overeem and Junior Dos Santos, which... On that note, just please don't. I hope those two don't do that because, man, they've been knocked out a lot. Just save your livelihood and your health. Moving on from here, though, some sad news from this week. Daniel Cormier, the great Daniel Cormier, lost his father. And I do want to read his Instagram note that he put. He said, Today I lost my hero to cancer. My father was the bravest, strongest, hardest working, and most caring person I've ever known. Always the life of the party, and made everyone he ever came in contact with feel good. I never could have imagined we would be going through this right now. And the lessons I want to try and pass along, I learned from my dad. You know, it's about the legacy we leave behind, and my dad's legacy will be one of just a great person, loving husband and father and friend to everyone. If you've ever met Percy Benoit, you're better for it. We were able to see some amazing things, Pops, and I hope you enjoyed the ride. I only wanted to make you proud. I love you, Pop. You were the strongest. You were the strength of this family. Now you get to rest. No more pain. Love you, Dad. Hashtag rest in peace. Hashtag cancer sucks. And also on that note, John Bone Jones, the notorious rival of Daniel Cormier, came out and put a very classy tweet out in regards to this. He said that all beef aside, I'm really sorry about your loss, DC. Know that he's in heaven with the opportunity to watch you front row and center for the rest of your life. Continue living a life that makes him proud. Thoughts go out to you and your family today. And, you know, every time somebody does something good and does something respectable like that, there's always this temptation to question motives and, you know, question whether this is just grandstanding. But if that's the case, we can never do anything good. So I applaud John Jones for that, and I also send my thoughts and prayers and all my sympathies and love toward who I believe has been a great ambassador for the sport that I love in Daniel Cormier. So I hope that him and his family find comfort during this time. But moving on, there's been a couple big fight announcements coming from this week. Number one, Demian Maia, number 10 ranked welterweight, will be taking on the number 11th ranked Ben Askren. This will headline in Singapore October 26 on UFC on ESPN Plus 20. Demian Maia coming off a pair of wins over Lyman Good and Rocco Martin, and Ben Askren notably coming off the infamous loss against Jorge Masvidal where he gets knocked out by a flying knee in 5 seconds. Just to give some credit here, one of our staples here on the CRP, Miguel Arati, match made for years, and he said that this is the fight that he wanted to see made because it's a good style fight between the heavy wrestler, grappler, Askren, and the great Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner in Demian Maia. So this will be a good test for both these guys, and I really like this fight, and I think it's appropriate. The next fight, I don't think so much is appropriate, and I want to know who's managing Darren Till. Darren Till has been announced that he's going to be fighting number 4 ranked middleweight Kelvin Gastelum at UFC 244 November 2nd at Madison Square Garden. And when I look at this, you got Darren Till, who was very hyped, got a welterweight title fight against Tyron Woodley, loses in the second round, doesn't even land a punch in the whole fight, and then gets just completely starched in his comeback fight against Jorge Masvidal in his home country in the UK. And now they're going to bring him up. They're going to make the appropriate move to middleweight, which a lot of people think he needed to do because he was cutting a lot of weight. He's a very big man. But they're going to put him in there with Kelvin Gastelum, who just went 5 hard rounds with Israel Adesanya, taking amazing amount of damage and hung in there, even hurt Adesanya a couple times, and is a legit middleweight. This guy beat Jacare. So I don't think that this is. I think that this is kind of malpractice on his management part. But nevertheless, Darren Till is going to get a big opportunity to fight a top-ranked middleweight right off the bat at UFC 241 November 2nd in Madison Square Garden. And finally, I want to give some thoughts on Andrew Luck, now former Indianapolis Colts quarterback, first-round draft pick back in 2012 for the Indianapolis Colts, 4-time Pro Bowler, NFL Comeback Player of the Year in 2018, led the league in passing touchdowns in 2014. He announced that his retirement early at the age of 29 years old this week. And it set off a firestorm of a lot of talk and controversy on this subject, including from his own fan base who booed him as he was leaving the stadium. And just real quick before I get into some thoughts on this, let's look at Andrew Luck real quick. Andrew Luck's there's an article here from SB Nation about his injury timeline. September 27, 2015, sprained shoulder. November 18, 2015, a lacerated kidney. September 1st, 2016, frayed labrum in preseason. January 19, 2017, shoulder surgery. October 2017, he returned to practice. November 2nd, 2017, Colts finally placed him on the IR. He was scheduled for rehab in November of 2017. Just a long list. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but just a long list of different incidents where this man was injured. And he decides to call it quits. Well, we've seen a lot of issues with not only NFL players, but MMA fighters who have drugged their career on way too long. And it turned out to be very harmful to to not only to their health, but also to their legacies. There was a study done not long ago where well over 90% of all dead NFL players that were studied, that they had CTE. And I believe the average lifespan of an NFL player is in their mid-50s, between 52 and 60 or 53 and 59, something like that I saw. They have a lot of injury. They have more injuries than combat sports fighters do, typically. There's a lot of CTE, a lot of neurological issues, a lot of just random injuries on the totality of their body. And here you have a guy, and we've seen this in mixed martial arts several times, where people have just held on too long. Obviously, Chuck Liddell taking brutal knockout after brutal knockout after brutal knockout, and even truds himself in there at 48 years old this past year to fight Tito Ortiz for a third time. Completely unnecessary. I can't believe that a sanction even allowed that to happen, and gets knocked out basically with the first punch he gets hit by. We've seen Anderson Silva snap his leg in half and then get another leg injury later on, and looks like a shell of himself when he gets hit. We've seen guys like Fedor dropping with the first shot that they get hit. And obviously BJ Penn is probably the most notable example of one of the best fighters the sport had seen, was one of the best fighters in the world, loses to Frankie Edgar, loses the rematch, comes back, gets a 20-second knockout to end the trilogy with Matt Hughes. Probably should have retired there, but kept fighting and now is on the longest losing streak in UFC history. And it just completely tarnished his legacy, and it's just it's just embarrassing and sad to even watch him walking into a cage. My thoughts on Andrew Luck when it comes to this is I applaud him, and I hope that he becomes an archetype, a model for future athletes to put their health first, to not be identified by what they do with their sport. That Chuck Liddell, you don't have to just be identified as the Iceman. BJ, you don't just have to be identified as the Prodigy. You can be more than just the Spider Anderson. And you can be more than just the Indianapolis Colts quarterback, Andrew Luck. This man has a family. This man has a life. And what's really shameful is that in this environment of spectator sports where we identify ourselves with our team and our favorite competitors, we won the Super Bowl, we lost the Super Bowl, we won the game, we lost the game. This is going to hurt us. No. Our identity is not wrapped up with our sport team. I love sports. I love spectator sports. I love to, to cheer for my favorites. But at the same time, when we are so focused on what these athletes can do for us and our enjoyment, and whether they are going to cause us to have a losing season or it's going to make things more difficult on us to win, and to the point where we don't even care about their health and what's best for them, and not even respect and encourage and support them in their decisions when they feel that it's time for them to walk away, then there's a problem. And, we become so wrapped up in that we forget that these people are humans with a life outside of the cage and outside of the lines. So with that, I applaud Andrew Luck, and I hope more follow in his footsteps. This has been a CRP weekly news roundup, and tune in next time. Stay tuned for further content from the CRP.